You got my slides?
For this, actually, you should be able on your computer to use the slides and it'll show up on the screen.
You want me to use my slides or your slides?
Yours, yeah.
Okay. So how do I share my screen?
In the lower right corner, there's a button that says Present Now, or just Present. If you click on that and then just share the whole screen, and then I'll get set up.
Okay. Interesting. So I can't see you, but I can only see my slides, correct?
Right. Yeah, because we don't have a webcam set up here.
Okay. Present your screen. Allow. Can you? Can you see my
That
slide?
looks good. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll wait a few minutes. Not quite 9 o'clock. Hang in there. Okay, we'll tell you when to start.
Okay. So you can see that I see you right now. Just switching back and forth. Does that work?
That works.
Okay. How are you guys doing?
They're trickling in.
How are
We
these?
know that the door was locked to the building a few minutes ago, so I had to go around and run it, but I propped something to keep it open.
It's much easier to do a talk without a mask on. I can't see you guys, but I can hear that you have masks on.
Okay. Is that better?
No, it doesn't matter. Either way.
Before we start, I do have a question. I read somewhere that tigers can get COVID. Is that true?
It is true. So can lions and large cats. Yep. The Bronx Zoo had a number of tigers and lions that had contracted COVID from their caretakers.
Wow.
Yep. That's what part of my talk's about. Just
By my Apple, I think we have about 1 minute to go.
I just want to let you know that if for some reason we get disconnected because my battery life isn't long enough, I will have to, I mean, it shouldn't happen, but if it does, we'll just have to use my phone at the end.
Okay.
I should have plenty.
Can you hear her?
Can you hear me okay?
Well, this is Dr. Deborah Scully, and she is presenting today. She's a veterinary doctor working on wildlife. Go ahead and start if you wish.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to telling you a bit about what my work does and how this major pandemic has similarities to what I do in the field. I am a wildlife veterinarian. I am executive director to VIEW, Veterinary Initiative for Endangered Wildlife. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about how what the missing piece to conservation is, which is wildlife health. There's been major, wonderful conservation efforts to save our endangered wildlife and protect landscapes. And they largely do it through by addressing habitat encroachment, by addressing with anti-poaching measures, as well as by addressing climate change. But as we can see with the pandemic today, disease can have a major impact on populations. Our pandemic, as you see, I am zooming in today, and you are either sitting over 6 feet apart, wearing a mask, and have changed your behavior by zooming in. Disease can spread rapidly to a healthy population and cause morbidity, not only locally, but globally. COVID-19 causes morbidity in about 1% to 2% of people. I have personally seen wildlife populations getting disease from our domestic animals and sharing it and causing a 90% mortality event in wild populations. So I am, we're really in tune with this pandemic. And so I think what I'll do is try to adapt how this pandemic really has been really having an effect on people. And how is that? Why is that? In the wet markets in China, they sell wildlife, and they either sell it for food, as you can see with this bat, and or they sell wildlife. They go out into the forest, they poach the animals, and they sell it for meat or for pets. So there's a major interaction and commingling of our wildlife with people. 75% of new and emerging diseases comes from wildlife, not just COVID-19. We know that we share 60% of diseases with all animals. And so there is a major interface between animals and people where there could potentially be a spillover of disease from wildlife to people or agricultural animals. So you may know about the brucellosis in bison, how it's very important and work that's being done on trying to reduce that interface where bison or wildlife populations like elk can give brucellosis, a disease that causes a production loss in cattle, but also indolent fever in people. And so trying to reduce that infection. How do we do that? We have to, if we don't have a vaccination, we have to do what we're doing right now. You have to increase the distance between your wildlife population and your domestic herds, or with people and people, by having facial protection, or you're preventing the next pandemic by using or outbreak by using vaccinations to reduce that infection, or by hygiene, by cleaning your hands and cleaning surfaces and being safe that way. So a number of years ago, I was working at Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and we got a call from a die-off of bighorn sheep outside of Yellowstone, north of Bozeman, actually. And we got out into our truck, out with a team, and in front of the truck was in the fields was a ram, and he was walking on the dirt paths in front of us. He was emaciated, staggering, and he collapsed. And we got out of the truck to see that he had taken his last breath. And when I looked up to the pastures, I saw riddled throughout the pastures dead and dying bighorn sheep. And we diagnosed that the domestic sheep had passed a disease to the bighorn sheep and caused a 90% mortality event locally. This has been happening for decades all over the Rocky Mountain region in the bighorn sheep populations. They get pneumonia from domestic sheep, but the domestic sheep don't have don't get sick at all. They carry a pathogen in their nasopharynx. They pass it to wildlife populations and can wipe out the naive population, the wild population. If you think about this in human terms, when the settlers came to North America and they brought with them diseases like smallpox or other diseases like measles, they spread it to Native American populations and was actually killed off over 90% of the Native American populations. So we can see that disease has effect on populations. And I didn't just see this in our backyard, but I also work in the Himalayas. It's happening on a global scale. And so we developed an organization to address wildlife health. Yes, veterinarians do treatment and treat the individual animal, but we also prevent and have preventive measures to have an effect on reducing the next outbreak and the next pandemic. So what do? We know that captive animals, from tigers in the zoos to elephants to wild populations in captivity, get disease from domestic animals. In fact, tigers get canine distemper from dogs. They can get rabies. They can get tuberculosis, and so I started a project was asked to go immobilize a tiger in Nepal. And when I got there, I heard of a story of a wild tiger who had, the day before I arrived, had just walked out of the park into the buffer zone, was completely emaciated and weak, and had collapsed into the hotel lobby of a local village. And the international story was that this tiger was a juvenile tiger. He had needed more space. There was habitat encroachment. The adult male tigers were pushing him out of the park. So they needed to find him a new park with less tigers. And I asked the question and said, well, did you test that tiger to see if that animal had exposure or was sick due to diseases that are shared with our domestic animals? They're just big kitty cats. They get cat diseases. They get canine distemper from dogs. And if you move them to if you move them to another park, you might be bringing with you a disease that is naive to the new park on tigers, but spreading a new disease to them. So that's just an example of what happens in wildlife, because we're working on and building these corridors. It's not just Nepal and it's not just Asia. We're building these corridors, which is very important to increase the genetic viability of our wildlife populations. But we want to be very careful not to introduce diseases that are naive to our wildlife populations. So we work on testing animals, on a disease surveillance program. We help try to improve capture techniques through safe capture. But definitely I have treated tigers and released them back to the wild, and treated baby rhinos who would not be around today had we not treated them. When it comes to critically endangered species, when it comes to animals that we really need to protect, we need to be able to know the health status of each individual animal, and we need to be able to have preventive measures and protect them from diseases that they may get, because we can. What's very exciting about veterinary medicine and a wildlife health program is that a lot of conservation efforts are combating things that are very challenging to fix. Climate change, habitat encroachment, anti-poaching measures. And it's not that wildlife health is easy to fix, but we have clear diagnostic techniques to investigate disease in these animals. And then, because of a lot of work that has been done in veterinary medicine and in captivity and domestic animals, we have clear measures of prevention and treatment. So what we're doing at VIEW, Veterinary Initiative for Endangered Wildlife, is we're just implementing those best practices in a way that's sustainable and in a way that can be used universally. So how do we do that? Well, we do that through collaboration. It's really important that we develop a program that's sustainable, that we don't just go into Nepal and treat that tiger and leave, because we really want to be able to treat future tigers, and we want to be able to train people that are the stakeholders on the ground how to incorporate wildlife health into their either biodiversity program or their conservation efforts. In Nepal, they have a very robust, excellent conservation program in their national parks, where they work really hard to protect their animals through anti-poaching measures, to protect the land so they have enough space. And they have really worked hard now to incorporate wildlife health into their conservation package. And we do that through training, providing infrastructure and research. In Nepal, we were able to train over 200 wildlife professionals in the field on safe capture techniques and how to collect biological samples and how to submit those samples to diagnostic laboratories and do research on their individuals. With tigers, we found novel diseases that were they were exposed to diseases that domestic animals carry or humans carry, and work needs to be done on protecting those animals from getting these diseases. We found the first case of tuberculosis in a rhino, and also saved elephants from herpes virus. We hired a local veterinarian to work in Chitwan National Park. We were able to build a field hospital, a field laboratory, a molecular laboratory with the Nepalese, and area where you can collect biological samples to submit them to diagnostic labs, and built relationships with diagnostic labs to investigate disease. Herpes virus is a virus in young elephants that is causing up to 50 to 60% of disease mortality actually in captive elephants in the U.S. and in Asia. In the U.S. and in Europe. It is unknown what the mortality events are in Asia or in the wild. And so in the Himalayas and in Nepal, our veterinarian was able to treat the first case of herpes virus in a young elephant. He implemented protocols that we helped develop, and he stayed up, 3 or 4 nights with this little baby elephant, baby Ham, and was able to treat him and use these protocols. And now he's going out and he's training other veterinarians locally, regionally, and globally on how to treat these elephants from this devastating disease. So the way we work is by really collaborating with the local government, local university, and with the local conservation organization. The conservation organization that we worked with in Nepal is sort of a quasi-government. They actually have a biodiversity center right there in Chitwan National Park. And so they were easily able to incorporate the laboratory in their in the park itself. In fact, there was a breeding center, an elephant breeding center, and a number of elephants around our laboratory, and animals like baby rhinos would come in, or owls would come in, and we were not only able to implement a disease surveillance program, but also treat some of these animals. And now they have a wildlife health hospital. So we built a national health program for Nepal. And one of the last things we did is that we helped with the Nepalese, with the local stakeholders, write a national wildlife health strategy plan for the country. They plan to hire 12 veterinarians throughout their national parks, and also use that template that we helped build in Chitwan and bring it to other national parks. In the United States, however, we only have 2 wildlife veterinarians for all of the national parks in the US. So wildlife health really is not incorporated into wildlife health programs. And the way we wanted to do it is really to do it not only to develop a program and collaborate and empower our local stakeholders, but make sure that we are prioritizing the most important species and the most important diseases that are affected by those species. And so we have, as well in the Himalayas, now in the Greater Yellowstone, have a list of all the species that are threatened or endangered in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as well as diseases that are really most affected by those animals. Now, we are doing a project in moose in the Wyoming region, in Jackson and Teton region, and that although moose are not on the endangered species list, they are an iconic species, and they had a major mortality event in the winter of 2019. So we were asked by Wyoming Game and Fish to partner with them in investigating cause of death And not only did we do that, but we are working with Montana State University, a PhD candidate who is also with USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, and they're looking at disease and how climate change may be affecting that. And so it's very important to build that template that we talked about before with the collaborators that are the most important stakeholders. So the researchers, the managers, and the universities, and get them involved in the work that we're doing, because we want these programs to outlive VIEW, because there's a lot more work to be done. We do have a scientific advisory team. My partner, Dr. Gretchen Kaufman, she lives in Washington. She is the former director of conservation medicine at Tufts University. You may all know who Raina Plowright is. She's at Montana State. We have 2 state wildlife veterinarians, Dr. Colin Gillen from Oregon and Dr. Mark Drew, who was at Idaho Fish and Game. And Tiara Smiley is our faculty member from UC Davis, who works with wildlife in the Himalayan region. So what are we doing with moose? What's the problem with moose? We know on a national level that moose are declining due to disease, and they have ebbs and flows of their population, so it depends on region. There are 3 diseases that we're finding that are really causing a big effect, and they're presenting with this complete hair loss, emaciated, and blood loss, anemic. One parasite is winter tick, and we're finding in this region as well that tens of thousands of ticks are gorging on the moose at a very fragile time in the year, which is in the spring or the late winter, is when the moose really need to have more energy. And now they're anemic, they have weight loss, and they have little hair to keep them warm. So we've collaborated with the regional, as I said, with regional collaborators, but as well nationally and also in Canada with researchers that have seen this problem and are working really hard to investigate and mitigate this issue. This photograph, the woman in the front with the yellow shirt is our VIEW veterinarian, Dr. Ginger Stout. She is down in Jackson. She is in charge of collecting biological samples, doing diagnostic techniques, and doing some training. As I said, we do training, infrastructure, and research. The person in the black hat, Troy Kozer, who is an MSU PhD candidate, he is working with USGS and investigating the winter tick, which is really a devastating problem that we're seeing in the northern regions where moose habitate. And so he is right here counting and transecting those ticks. And the 2 other people are folks from Wyoming Game and Fish. Their project is to collar moose and look at the migration of moose. And so it's really this collaborative effort to look at where moose are migrating, investigate the vector that may be causing the mortality in the moose, seeing if climate change is having an effect. They're postulating that because winter tick are able to stay longer on the moose and not fall off due to warming of climate, this may be having a possibility of why the moose, we're seeing more of a disease now. And then VIEW, investigating cause of death. All too often in wildlife, an animal dies and no mortality or no postmortem examination has happened. And it's really important that we understand first the cause of death before we start saying it was caused by climate change or caused by habitat encroachment. In fact, if you can think of, I remember last spring or last summer, there was a die-off of 1,200 birds in the Billings region, and they had all died around this water body. And the agency personnel who was interviewed on the news was asked, what happened, and they said, well, I'd asked some of the farmers around here, and a hailstorm happened yesterday, and so 1,200 birds died due to a hailstorm, and no postmortem examination was done by that by anyone, and it's most likely was caused by something like botulism that can cause a mass die-off. Not necessarily due to hail, but all too often we'll have a hunch or kind of guess what the cause is, and then go down the avenue of trying to help these animals. In fact, in Wyoming, they have built a bridge from what I've been told, is to help the moose not get hit by car, which is a great thing, and help other wildlife not get hit by car. But if the main cause is due to disease, then we really need to investigate what is the cause of death, and then we can mitigate what the problems are. We are also finishing up a bison study. We partnered with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and VIEW and the Diagnostic Lab in Wyoming to look at historic records. So what often what will happen is in bison, they collect blood for brucellosis, and then they store those archive samples. So we asked the Diagnostic Lab and the agencies if we could investigate those archive samples of diseases that bison may share with domestic or agricultural animals, and see if there's a red flag there, to see if there were any diseases that could actually, rather than just looking at a disease that's zoonotic or doesn't cause a die-off in bison like brucellosis, but rather a disease that can cause a die-off like pneumonia or diarrhea virus, or things that we have seen in other captive bison herds, like at the Ted Turner Ranch. They're seeing certain diseases that are causing a major mortality event in their bison herds, and we're not really investigating it in the free-roaming bison herds in Yellowstone or around the region, because really there's not been enough funding to support these measures. And so we did see, we tested, we looked at archive samples of 200 bison over 20 years, and we did see one disease in particular that is a red flag. But more investigation needs to be done, because, as I said earlier about the bighorn sheep die-off with pneumonia, the domestic bison now across the country are seeing Mycoplasma pneumonia as well, causing major mortality events in their captive herds, and they're able to vaccinate for it. So what is VIEW really about is that we have to be able to really get prepared to, if there is in the face of an outbreak or in the face of the pandemic, not to just be scratching our heads, but actually have a national health or wildlife health strategy plan and systems in place to be able to mitigate for that. And so one really huge conservation contribution VIEW has been able to develop, I think, is connectivity. And so not only have we created partners, and we're collaborating with universities, and we're trying to investigate with research diseases, but we have developed an electronic medical record system to be able to put these pieces together. One of the frustrations I had, when I was working at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, I'm sure they're more advanced now, but we just had an Excel spreadsheet to work off of. And when I was in Nepal, literally, we just had notebooks that they were writing down, which is great, which is more than what's happening in this country in national parks, but they were recording illness and mortalities in their threatened and endangered species. And so we partnered with a database company in Nepal that had built a database for the cancer hospital, human hospital, and we developed what we now call the Wildlife Health Information System. So this pictorial example here is, this is a sick or dead moose or a colored moose. So we collect that biological sample while they're either immobilized or while they're dead. And we input that information into the computer, where they located. Any photographs of the animal can be uploaded onto our electronic database system, our GPS locations. And then when our samples are taken, either blood or tissue or fecal, we can put on that storage repository either a barcode that can marry right up to our electronic medical record system, and then so you don't lose them in the refrigerators or freezers. I will say there were a number of times when I worked at FWP that I was trying to find some samples and it was very difficult to find. So this really helps that not only is it recording this animal's information and we're submitting those to diagnostic laboratories, or we're archiving those animals, but it's really put in one location and easy to find. And it's very user friendly. We did it because, if English is your second language, we want to make sure that it's something that's very easy to use. And it has very different systems and securities in place. So a veterinarian might have full access of the medical records, where a field technician will have able to input, their name, their information, that wildlife information, and upload photographs, but might not be able to write into the medical record system itself. And then one of the issues that I was finding was that a lot of the information, this critical information of mortalities of threatened and endangered species, wasn't really being reported to the people that were the managers that were making the decision to help the animals. So we have a very friendly, this database program is used on the cloud and can be utilized if you have the authority to do so in Kathmandu in Nepal, or in the jungle in Chitwan National Park, if that's what you plan to do, or the same thing, let's say in Wyoming, if you're in the field, or the personnel and the agency themselves. And so if you're interested in knowing about moose in the Jackson region and only females during this time of year, and see where their locations are, it is a very searchable, easy engine to give you a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet. It can tell you that location. And then wow, maybe this region is a problem because of poisoning or toxin or health. And so then you can just press a button and generate that report, and that can be submitted in a very professional manner to the higher ups, the people that really need it, and the management, in order to help support a healthy population. So we're just in the beta testing phase of our WISP program, and we're using it in Wyoming. We hope to use it in other regions that we've been discussing with other areas in the US, as well as in Asia. We are partnering with UC Davis and Baylor Medical, where in Myanmar, which is another country just near Nepal in the Himalayan region, they have the largest captive elephant population in the world. They have 6,000 captive elephants and 98 veterinarians. They've asked us to help them connect those veterinarians in order to get more information about their elephants and investigate herpes virus in the elephants. And so they're doing a serological study and utilizing WISP and uploading information on the WISP program, so that once we get more information on their health, we're hoping with Baylor Medical, they're hoping to develop a herpes virus vaccine. That'll be the first in the world to really be able to help prevention on a larger scale. So we're very excited about that project. So the current pandemic definitely is applicable to VIEW. For many years, I was trying to tell people how important wildlife health is into conservation efforts. So many people said, like, let nature take its course. But we get down to the point where we have threatened and endangered species. We no longer can just let nature take its course when habitat encroachment and it is encroaching on these wildlife. They have less space. They're being encroached by people and domestic animals that are not only taking their food supply, taking their space, but now they're also sharing diseases with them. We can be better, and if we can include wildlife health into our conservation efforts, then we won't be left with empty corridors, and we, save all of this land, and we won't want to be left with those empty corridors. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
We'll try. Let's see. I see 2. Here we go.
Near the beginning of the lecture, you were talking about how a lot of endangered animals aren't being tested before they're moved. Is there any particular reason that people aren't testing them?
No, really, it's just that we've gotten better and better in conservation. It's not that we don't want to test them. It's really just another, I won one of the most prestigious entrepreneur fellowships called the Ashoka Fellowship because this is a new way of looking at conservation. It's not something that's been done. It is being done when you're looking at zoonotic disease, and definitely there's silo projects that are out there that are that know to investigate disease, but it really needs to be on a larger scale. It needs to just be included in all conservation work, and so I think that we are getting better and starting to do that, absolutely. And I think because there's limited resources, we really need to prioritize the species that we're working with, making sure that each and every one of them we are collecting those samples. And even if we don't have the funding to run those samples right away, we can archive those samples to look at it in the future. But yeah, a lot of good work is being done on sort of silo projects, but comprehensively. And especially, like, example in tigers in Asia, they literally didn't have any energy out in the field. So when they had a biodiversity center, there was no electricity. So we came in, and I actually went out and bought the generator, bought the solar panels, bought the refrigerator, and so that they actually had a place where they could actually store those samples to a date when they had the authority and the approvals to be able to diagnose disease.
All right, so this is going to be a bit of a weird question, but I have a little bit of a lead up to it. Bison, they were almost hunted to extinction, and now their territories where they used to be are basically empty or completely empty of bison. And those territories haven't completely died. So why should I care about moose?
Good question. So you should care about all the charismatic species. So we're not saying I just care about bison and I just care about moose. The reason why we were doing the project with the moose and the bison, well, one, we have very limited funding, and two, there was of the 200 moose in the Jackson region, 50 died in the winter of 2019. So we were addressing the moose problem because we were asked to do that. Collaboration is huge. And with that, developing a wildlife health program is about putting the template, and it doesn't really necessarily matter which species. It's great to have important species, but then now that template can be used for other species as well. So great. If we had the funding, we would absolutely do bison. If we had the funding, we would do mountain lions. They have the plague. They were found in the Jackson region to have the plague. We would do lynx. We would do caribou. Absolutely, we would do more wildlife. But any other questions?
Well, okay, I care about moose, and I don't quite know why. but I think more and more people are starting to understand resources and how we used to plummet them, and now we're trying to live with them much better. Now, as far as the veterinary profession goes, most veterinary people work with animals that are economic. And what percent of the veterinarians, as a side project, work on endangered species? Is it a large percent or is it a small percent?
None, not very
None.
many. I mean, I wouldn't have won the Ashoka Fellowship if, there were a lot of veterinarians doing what I'm doing. And so we're very fortunate. There are two groups here. You have, you definitely have zoo veterinarians that are doing research in the field, that are going out and doing silo projects, tigers and rhinos, or lions in Africa get canine distemper. There's a study going on investigating canine distemper, and then doing ring vaccinations of the dogs that carry the disease into the park. But there's not that, the percentage is minor, and there's a lot more veterinarians that would love to do wildlife work. But there's, because there's limited funding, and because we need to include wildlife health into conservation efforts, it's not being done. There are not enough wildlife veterinarians. But there's just, if there was funding, I know that there would be.
And hi, it's me again. I'm sorry I'm playing devil's advocate with these questions, but I'm selfish. Why should I care again?
You don't need
Like,
to. I mean,
how-
I'm not asking you to care about your physics class or asking you to care about your calculus class. And if you don't really care about wildlife, that really doesn't matter. But in order to have iconic species, and if we want to be able to have threatened and endangered species like wolves, if you don't care about the wolves or the grizzly bears, then okay. But the fact is that they are part of the ecosystem, and if they die off, it does cause an imbalance in the ecosystem. So there's a beautiful video in Yellowstone, and showing what the importance of wolves are to the ecosystem. When they reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone, it helped increase the population, reduce the elk population around the riparian area, so therefore increase the riparian area, which also increased the songbirds and the beaver dams, and increased the fish life. And if you like to fish, that's kind of important because the cutthroat trout have increased. And so so it really all binds together. So if you just have one species and it gets extinct, then it does imbalance your ecosystem. And you were seeing that on a global scale. So let's just say, in the East, they have this huge overpopulation of white-tailed deer because you don't have the predators anymore. And so now you have this huge increase of the tick population, and now you have Lyme's disease, and it is affecting human health enormously on the East because of that overpopulation. So management measures, once you start to try to tweak the and destroy your wildlife populations, it does have an effect on our ecosystem. And as I said, right, it affects us. And if you have 60% of diseases is shared with people, and 75% of disease is are the new and emerging diseases, we should probably be on the ground investigating for disease surveillance, and so a lot of the work is being done on rats, bats, and primates, but not a lot of the work is being done on other wildlife. And so just for human preservation alone, it would be important to incorporate wildlife health.
Well, I'll try something here. About 200,000 years ago, the human population was no more than 200 women and some men in southern Africa. And with such a small population, do you think actually, what are the implications of that? One implication is that a lot of human diseases couldn't survive. Our population was so small. Do you see that sort of thing with endangered species populations where the animals are far apart. There aren't many of them, like wolverines or any of the animals you're talking about. What's your reflection on the size of the population relative to sustaining diseases?
Well, and that's one of the key factors why I stopped what I was doing and really wanted to focus on this, was because we have these very small, fragile populations, and so we saw it in the Dakotas, where you had a dog disease called canine distemper nearly completely wipe out the black-footed ferret population, or canine distemper has done it a lot on a global scale, nearly caused an extinction of the wild dog population. And so so I realized that it's not just habitat encroachment and anti-poaching measures, but to be able to keep these animals healthy, we needed to incorporate wildlife health. And so, this is something that should be included. And it's not something that's just, on its own project. If you can just see, like on the New Moose Project, which could be anything, on any species, if you're researching an animal and you're immobilizing them, that's a beautiful opportunity to be able to collect biological samples. Or when an animal dies, that's another opportunity to investigate. So if these animals are dying due to disease or these tiny small populations, to make them healthy will help build up a more robust population, which has been happening. I mean, you see it many times with not only disease, but with poisons or toxins. Once you understand the poison or toxin like lead or DDT, then you remove that insult, that population increases.
I noticed, or is there any opposition to your work? Like any big reason that you're not being able to do more? Because I noticed in your map with the Wildlife Health Information System, there wasn't any application in most of Asia. Is there a reason for that?
Because we're just in the process of developing it. So with the application in Asia, we are building an app for the Myanmar project. So right now it's a computerized program. We want to build an app. We're just as I said earlier, we're just in the beta phase. We need to get funding for the last bit of the phase in order to roll it out as a program.
If you could recommend one or two books to read that probably we haven't encountered that expose much of your science, what would they be?
There isn't a lot written on wildlife health. There is a book called Conservation Medicine. One of the founders is Dr. Gretchen Kaufman, and Gary Tabor actually is a veterinarian from Bozeman. And that really puts together what conservation medicine is wildlife health, is incorporating veterinary medicine into conservation efforts.
Well, I would like to thank you for that fine talk, and good luck.
Yeah.
I also am a bit of an outlier. I work on flipping plant pathology into controlling weeds. And I bet there's only 2 of us in the world that are doing that. So I understand you definitely are an outlier, and we're in the same camp. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Well, very good. Thank you for having me today.